Hello and welcome, everybody. If you were one of the thousand or so people who were trying to watch the launch of the 2020 World Press Freedom Index, Reporters Without Borders sends its apologies for the wait that you had. We had a great private conversation, and the good part is I get to again talk to whistleblower Edward Snowden. He's the author of Permanent Record. He's also the president of the Press Freedom Foundation. Is that right?
Freedom of the Press Foundation.
I always get that mixed up. The Freedom of the Press Foundation. Edward, it is good to see you again. What was your reaction? Decisive. It's a decisive decade for journalism. What was your reaction to that report?
Yeah. I mean, everybody who looks around right now, they can see, they can feel what's in the air. Everything is changing rapidly. We are seeing new powers being claimed. We're seeing new powers being abused. And we're seeing, of course, governments sort of tearing open new avenues into our private lives under the justification of emergency measures. They always say these are temporary, it's for this reason or that reason. But there's nothing more permanent than a temporary measure. And when I look at this, for as long as I have worked in technology, I've studied what's happening. I've looked at things. I've just tried to figure out what all of this means by looking at the world in terms of systems. And the more time passes, the more that method makes sense to me, because all of the processes that matter to us today, environmental, technological, social, political, they're all connected and they're all interdependent, parts of the same whole, parts of the same system. And that system is now failing. Our efforts to correct it are being stymied in large part because the first step to fixing a problem is understanding it. And humanity's traditional method for rapidly digesting and sharing information, journalism, is under attack. And I think that's an intentional strategy. I don't think it's a coincidence. I don't think it's a mistake. I don't think it's an unintentional overreach or an emergent reaction. And I hate to say that this is something that has been sadly true for as long as I can remember, as well documented by your work with Reporters Without Borders. But I regret to say that it seems the intensity of these attacks are increasing at the very moment when we're approaching what I consider the apex of crisis. In places where reliable information is most difficult to obtain, such as China, we've witnessed new efforts to expel journalists and keep them out of the country and bar their work. We've seen pressure on their colleagues. We have seen influence campaigns against their outlets and institutions. And it's not just in China and places like it. In Brazil, federal prosecutors sought to imprison a journalist for exposing corruption in the justice ministry. In the UK, the whole of society is standing by as the most basic tenets of international law and human rights are being disregarded in order to extradite Julian Assange, the publisher of WikiLeaks, for 17 counts of espionage, which is, according to the charging documents, apparently how we've come to describe the act of publishing true and correct information for the public in the modern era. In Russia, we have seen major newspapers like Vedomosti have a change of ownership. Sort of oligarchs come in, shares get traded, and then suddenly you see chief editors being replaced, and the new guys in charge put their favored guy in, and suddenly he starts using his editorial authority to say, look, these stories are too political, changing this headline, saying you can't run this kind of reporting. And suddenly a newspaper that, at least by Russian standards, appears to be, more independent than some, suddenly looks a whole lot less independent. And it's not just one paper. We have seen this happening again and again and again, and this process is accelerating. In Russia, we see this dynamic happening at the same time the government, the state, is climbing up the ladder of sort of laws against so-called false information, the spreading of rumors. And again, we see this in many countries around the world, which tragically brings us to the United States, where no less than the president himself leads the same war in the same words from behind a podium that even his supporters admit is the origin of a great deal of the very fake news that he so often decries. And when we're talking about sources, just as we see the powers of our day, be they corporate or governmental, increasing their control over the means and conveyances of information under the justification that they're trying to stamp out false information, the sources of true information, the sources of journalism, are under the kind of threat that we have really never seen before. It has always been difficult to be a journalist's source, just as when you're breaking a truly impactful and meaningful story as a journalist, we know it has personal and professional risks, sometimes risks to life, unfortunately. But what we are seeing is what I think is a strategic transformation away from merely targeting journalists and journalist sources, who have always been the primary targets of persecution in this process, to now prioritizing and elevating secondary figures, secondary targets, as it were, in the news-making and public understanding processes. By this, I mean we are seeing for the first time retaliation being taken in a systemic way against oversight officials, against watchdogs, against inspectors general. And we see this happening in places like the United States. And these are just the smallest examples of a very long list of the threats that we see facing the work of a free press today. And yet a skeptical press is never more critical than in times of crisis. And it is in precisely these times of crisis that meaningful journalism has come to carry the greatest risk. So what does that mean? When we are making it more difficult to do journalism, when we are making it more difficult to gather, analyze, and disseminate, publish meaningful information that is critical to the public. And we are at a point of vulnerability where we need access to this information. What we are going to find very rapidly is we're not going to have access to information precisely at the moments when we need it the most. As a society and as the ultimate stewards of the system, the system of our world, we must be willing to protect those who do the work of warning and preparing us to weather this continuing series of shocks and at times assaults that are fundamentally the progress of history. We are always going to struggle. We are always going to face challenges. We are always going to have crises. Because building a society of the complexity and connection that is before us today, continuing that work, is difficult. There are people who will want to exploit that. There are people who will want to maximize their power. And there are institutions who will go against the current order of the day and try to upset it. And look, the work of journalism is imperfect, right? There are legitimate criticisms that can be made about this story, about this outlet, about this reporting. And yet, journalism is necessary. Corrections can be made. Improvements are a part of the process of journalism. Correcting the record is a thing. But if we cannot or do not protect journalism, the system of our world will fail, and the cost will be measured in freedoms.
One of the things that your work, the whistleblowing that you did, is on mass, the kind of mass surveillance that was being done by governments. In the last few years of the reports of Reporters Without Borders on their Press Freedom Index, one of the biggest changes that they put in was disinformation. Disinformation coming in from the new gatekeepers, because it's clear from your actions that you respected journalism. You went to journalists to go through the information that you had. But now journalists are no longer the gatekeepers. Technology platforms are, social media platforms are, and the role of the gatekeeper has changed. That's brought in this disinformation. Uh, what role do you see technology and social media platforms playing now?
Yeah, this is a point of tremendous controversy because some people like to see journalists and institutions of journalism as the gatekeepers, right? But I think there's more complexity to it than that. When we talk about misinformation and social media, technology platforms, what they have done is democratize the means of publication, the means of transmission. Now anybody can put anything out there. What journalism does, I think, best, organized journalism rather, is to be able to commit resources, human, financial, everything, into researching, studying the facts, ultimately looking at conflicting claims and trying to determine what is true or more likely to be true based on the evidence that's available to us. And then making hard calls when there are groups at cross purposes. For example, the government says the public should not know that there's a global system of mass surveillance that's violating all of their rights. Because they go, look, it may give us a useful means of investigation. The more secret it is, the more effective it is. But on the other side, that is a violation of every individual's rights and our collective rights. And who should make the call as to whether the public should or should not know this? It could have been me. It could have been anyone who knew this information. I could have just put it up in a tweet. But I felt that I had strong political opinions. I gathered the evidence. But I think journalism and journalists are intentionally designed, at least in the U.S. system with our First Amendment protections, they are entrusted to challenge the government in an institutional way. That's why we call them the Fourth Estate. The government traditionally has a monopoly on many facts because they use classification powers and things like that to say, we might be doing it, but we won't tell you one way or another, and you can't do anything about it. So what do? We investigate, and then we gather the facts, and then somebody somewhere has to look at this and go, okay, it is true. What parts of it can be published without creating extraordinary risks, right? And this was what I tried to do in my work with journalists, was to maximize the public benefit while minimizing or mitigating the theoretical risks of mitigating the risks of publishing meaningful information in a free and open society that the government does not want to be published. The government says, these things shouldn't be published because it'll get people hurt, because the atmosphere will catch on fire, because the oceans will boil off. And we have to look at those things and go, well, is that actually happening? Will it happen? Will it not happen? How credible are these claims? What are they willing to show evidence for? And this is the process that was followed in every case. However, that's not to say that this is correct or the only method, the only way of doing it. It's the one that I felt was the best place to mitigate even theoretical risks. However, when we go into this new free-for-all of technical platforms, right, people are putting things out there. There can be true and useful information that no one else is willing to put out. Maybe there are commercial interests. In the United States, there's a lot of commercial influence in journalism, and that's the same in many other countries. Somebody puts it out and it's true. Well, now we have a new problem. We have access to more information than we've ever had before, but as you say, how do we know what of this information is true, is correct, is reliable? Who tests that? And that is, I think, what we're really struggling with. The social media companies, the technology companies, are increasingly trying to play a role there. They're going, well, we'll hire people and they'll say, this is reliable or this is fake news. And, in some ways, maybe that can be useful, but I think that's actually the wrong approach. Because these institutions already have so much power over our lives. They have so much information about us, about our interests, about our connections, about our reading habits. And if we start putting them in the position where they go, well, this protest can't be promoted, or this speech is too extreme for the platform. There are many cases where that could be good and beneficial for society, but I can imagine a whole lot more in a whole lot of countries where that actually does damage to democracy and to the progress of human rights. So it is very much a difficult question.
The hard part is you exposed mass surveillance of a powerful nation, of the United States, and it's the Five Eyes. But now you have someone like Shoshana Zuboff writing a book about surveillance capitalism, that now it's not just in the hands of governments, that private companies have this capacity as well. Given pandemic, given the coronavirus, and that it is impossible to roll everything back, that we are now giving even more power to governments. Contact tracing. This is actually one of the questions from the audience. With these types of things, how do we move forward? How can we solve the problem of the virus without losing more of our freedoms?
I think some of it comes into how you expressed the concern as we go, we can't roll any of this back, or we can't roll all of this back. And that is the challenge that we face with these emergency measures. Once a government starts doing something, once corporations start doing something, once it has been done, once it becomes a fait accompli, they try to convince us that that's good and right and natural and it can never change, because they've become accustomed to the privilege. And I don't think that's quite correct. I think that's actually the problem that we face today. When you look at the mass surveillance system that was revealed in 2013, the practice of mass surveillance, and you look at the rise of surveillance capitalism as it's described today, they're actually the same thing. When you look at the stories of 2013 that had the most impact, that created the greatest scandal, it wasn't what the government was doing alone. It was the government was going to the corporations. They were going to the major telecommunications providers in the United States, and they were saying, we want the phone records of everyone in the United States, man, woman, child, regardless of whether they're suspected of crime, and we want you to provide them to us every single day on a rolling basis. They went to the major internet service companies. They went to Google, they went to Apple, they went to Facebook, they went to Yahoo, and many more. And they went, look, we've got a process in secret courts where we're going to rubber stamp warrants, and this is a court that was asked about 34,000 times in over 33 years to authorize surveillance for the government. And out of those 34,000 times, roughly, they heard from this court no only 11 times in 33 years. So this is very much a rubber stamp. And yet that was good enough for many of these companies. These companies then began secretly collaborating with government, where government would sort of slip them a rubber stamped piece of paper that says this email address, this user, this person here, we want everything that's on your servers. And they would make a perfect copy from their servers and they would pass it to the government and no one would be the wiser. The person who had been subject to this surveillance wouldn't even be notified. They wouldn't get a chance to contest it in court. But the core here is, as much as the government was doing, as much as this intrusive capability was being constructed and carried out, we were creating for the first time perfect records of private lives at a scale that had never been done before. It was leading to something greater, which is to what we see today. The government power and the corporate power were not separate institutions that were working to their own ends. They were, in fact, melding together into something entirely new. And it is this collaboration between corporate and government power that we have seen today emerge into something quite unexpected, I think, which is actually governments have such an appetite for the capabilities and the information, the data that these companies hold on individuals, that governments are beginning to become clients to corporations. Governments are, in a unusual way, beginning to be subordinate to these companies in a way that I think would have been quite difficult to predict. And this has emboldened the companies. They understand now the appetites of government for this information, and they understand how much power, how much influence, how much money can be had if they have something that no one else can provide. And so what we have seen over the last decade is a race to see who can know the most about the most people, know the most about the most. And this is what we struggle with today. So again, it raises the question, all right, so what do we do about it? Well, the first thing is we have to look at this and go, is this okay? We are told this is right and proper. We are told that, look, we can't do anything in court about this because it's not our records. Even if the data is about you, even if it's your messages, they say, well, these things belong to the companies. They're the company's records. They're on the company's servers. But nobody at the company created that record. You created that record. It's your activities. And our laws have not been updated to address this. There is a fundamental issue that is unresolved in privacy law around the world today, which is there is no universally recognized ownership right of data about you, data that is created about you, data that's held about you, data that's processed about you. They say it's not yours. And I think that's incorrect. I think if we change that, and this is a simple legal reform that only needs to be done in one major jurisdiction, and then all the technology companies will have to rejigger their systems, and basically it'll be a global reform even if it happens in one major jurisdiction. Because you can't you can't ignore that change. Technically, if a user has to have the ability to go, you can't use that way, or you can't keep that, or you can't track me, I don't agree with that, then suddenly everything will change. Right now, the problem is today it's unimaginable for a lot of people. There's this popular thing that, like, oh, people don't care. It doesn't matter to people. And I've been talking to people about this for years in every country and every platform you can imagine. And people do care. People are furious about what's being done. The thing is, they feel like they can't do anything about it. They have been disempowered to the point that they feel like they have no more influence over their own governments, over their own policies, over this system that increasingly rules them, rather than is something that they are partnered to and part of in this process. And I think once we realize that, collectively, change will happen very quickly.
RSF's report says that this is the decisive decade for journalism, and your own life and the risks, the sacrifices you've made. You're living in Russia instead of in the United States. You can't go back. You could get arrested. You would get arrested if you went back to the US. These sacrifices that you've made to live by, to be a whistleblower, this seems to be what this decade is going to demand. Uh, what advice would you give to journalists, people who want to get the truth out?
Yeah, look, I spoke once with a very senior journalist who wrote it, one of these journalism reviews. And she told me something, and I was, quite early on in my notoriety here, and had very much, I did trust journalists and the institution of journalism to play their role, and I think they played it well in my case. But she said the more that she knows journalists, the less that she likes them. And, coming from someone who had worked in journalism, I thought this was a crazy thing. And it was because she felt that they were becoming cynical. And I actually agree with her to an extent there. But as I've spent more years, this happened more than 5 years ago, I think, I've realized that it's not journalists, it's all of us. We feel like we know everything. That little Google search box, the accessibility of information, allows us to pull up any argument to support our own pre-existing, cognitive biases. But how does that change? Somebody out there, somewhere, cares enough to make the argument that no, actually, all of you are wrong. You think you understand what's happening, but actually you look at this, and this, and this, and this, and what do you think now? And I think that's really the heart of journalism. And I think that's what it takes to change this. We talk about blowing the whistle. We talk about the sacrifices that I made. There were over 30,000 people working at the NSA. Not all of them knew what I did, but there were plenty of people who should have known or could have known, and they could have done something, and they didn't. For me, it wasn't about, standing up and saving the world. I haven't saved the world, and I don't think that one person can, but what we can do is we can make it better, one step at a time. We can do something for ourselves, for our families, for our communities, to say, look, I know you think that, but I have seen evidence that actually something very different is happening, and I think it's alarming, and I think we should do something about it. I think we should reconsider the path that we're on. And that's what this is. We talked about this feeling of disempowerment. Whether you're a journalist, whether you're an ordinary person, the world is facing an extraordinary slate of threats on basically every axis of progress. We are at the beginning of an age of regression if we do nothing. But progress can be sustained, and the way we do that is we recognize that, people talk about reform and this potential to fix things, and they think, well, if we just wait, eventually they'll wake up and things will get better, the people in charge. But power doesn't listen. Power only responds. Reform only occurs if it is pushed upon institutions. It is something that is willed into existence by a collective civil ideal. And there is no class in the world that is more capable of developing that kind of popular consensus than journalists. And I think when we look at this, particularly for those who've been in journalism for a while, who are feeling that cynicism, is go, look, you're right, the world is in a tough place, but it's only going to get better one way, and that's with you. Yeah, you can start and make a difference one way. You can stand up, you can blow the whistle, you can, whistleblowing isn't about who you are. It's not about your skill set. It's about what you can prove. It's about what you've seen. And this is what I think journalists are good at. And this is what everybody has a role in, wherever you work in your office, whether you work for the government, whether you work for the company, whether you work, at a convenience store, if you see something that matters, and we all see things that matter in different parts of our lives, and you say, I can't ignore this, that's the beginning of something more. Tell somebody about it. Persuade them as best you can that this is something worth considering, and see if they agree with you. And if they do, you tell somebody else, Reform is a process that starts with you, but it does not end with you. We have to stop thinking in these binary terms where either we save the world or the world saves itself, but there's nothing we can do. Either we do everything or we do nothing. No, all we have to do is enough. And enough is a very little amount, but it's more than nothing. And I think if we start, we'll make things better.
There's a point, though, in your life where you stood up and you developed the courage to stand up and say, this is wrong. And that's kind of what journalists have to go through now against power, right? It's gotten much harder, and every person reaches that point, and many people back down.
Yeah.
What is that point? How do you push more people to have the courage to do that? Like, what went through your head? Why did you decide to do it?
The thing for me was I looked at the trend, and I remembered the internet of my youth. I remember what it used to be like to be anyone, to be no one, and to just say what you thought. You could be incredibly wrong. You could say something incredibly stupid, or you could say something crushingly honest, but might have been embarrassing, or it might have been painful if it was linked to your personal identity. But no one remembered. They said nowadays they say the internet never forgets. But back then the internet forgot immediately because nobody cared and nobody knew who you were. We picked our own names, and the names changed every week. And as we saw the early creative and cooperative internet be replaced by an increasingly commercial and competitive internet, as the means of communication became a mechanism for profit, and as governments began to use it as a platform for predation, and to be able to basically look at everyone and pull anyone off the board, know all of their secrets, do everything like that. I thought, well, what is the world going to look like? What is tomorrow going to look like if I do nothing? What if nobody knows about this just because people like me never say anything about it until it's too late? Because the longer these powers exist, the longer these systems are allowed to entrench themselves in the operations of these institutions, the harder they are to change, the harder they are to roll back. And honestly, one of the greatest criticisms I have of myself is that I waited far too long. But I think for everyone else, particularly journalists, there are a lot of journalists, I think, who keep their head down, and they're doing so rationally. They are looking at the attacks against journalists today. They are looking at the rising tide of hate-mongering from officials in many different countries. the intentional targeting that does, in many cases, result in violence. And they go, look, I've got bills, I've got a family, or I just want to get to the end of the day and watch my shows. They go, this is not for me. I can't fix it on my own. But when you think about what happens if you do nothing, and you think about what that means for your family, you think about what that means for the world that you are going to have to live in, along with everyone else. And then you consider just for a moment what the alternative might be. If you took a risk. Because it's not enough to believe in something. It's not enough to believe that things have to change. It's not enough to believe that we need reform. You have to stand for something if you want something to change. And I think we see extraordinarily brave journalists. We see extraordinarily brave people in every occupation today, because crisis and tragedy, as terrible as they are, they have a way, I believe, in bringing out the best in individuals. But I don't want people to think, this is something that happens without sacrifice. You don't have to light yourself on fire. But you can't just sit on the couch and wait for things to get better. It really does start with you.
Fantastic. Thank you. My gosh. Those are great words of advice. And there does come a moment when you have to stand up. This is where journalism is headed in the decade of crisis that we're living through. Edward, it is so good to speak with you again. We're going to hear again from Joseph Stiglitz, from Rana Ayub, from Christophe Deloy, the Secretary General of RSF. I'm Maria Ressa. See you again soon.
Thank you so much. It was good to be with you, Maria. Stay free.